Hello.
Hello. I think you
There we go.
yeah, there we go.
There we are.
Hello. Just to compound the missing link, my O2 signal dropped out, so my texts that I was trying to send you weren't going through either.
Oh no.
So
Oh dear.
I'm here, I'm waiting.
Yeah. Let's hope it lasts.
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Can everyone hear me okay? Because yeah, is everyone's audio okay? Yep.
Yes, I'm good.
Brilliant. So thank you for joining us, Sharon. I'm just going to do a quick introduction if that's okay, and then we'll commence. So hello everyone. I'm very excited to welcome here with us today artist Sharon Adams. After a successful career in events management, Sharon left London in 2008 to join the full-time degree course in 3D materials practice at the University of Brighton, graduating in June 2011. In the process of her studies, it became clear that she had time to move back to Northern Ireland. So in spring 2013, she exchanged her London flat for a lovely old farmhouse next to a family home in County Antrim. With her workshop established in one of the stone bars, she continues to explore the landscape around her. Her practice explores the theme of work and tools using wood, metal, and textiles. She makes functionalist tools, which invite the viewer to imagine what they might be used for. Recent exhibitions include Horizon, a solo show at Our Space Gallery in Lisbon, Contained at Process Yard, and Intersection, a solo show at Flowerfield Arts Centre, and also a part of the recent Drawing Beyond Itself exhibit at Air Gallery Altrincham. So I'm going to pass you on now to Jayson, who will kickstart with the first question, and hopefully we can create an interesting conversation not only about Sharon's practice today, but also in drawing.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, thanks for joining us. First question, yeah, so you graduated a full-time degree course in 3D material practice at the University of Brighton in June 2011. Can you tell us a bit about your interest in sort of 3D materials, how that came about, and the continued influence on your work as it is now?
Yeah, that's quite a huge question, you know. I guess I you know, art school came quite late for me. I studied, I guess I was in my late 30s by the time I went to Brighton. I had sort of come through a fairly academic school and studied science when I first went to uni. But by the time I sort of hit my 30th birthday, I realized that my friends were all creatives. So I began to kind of suspect that, you know, maybe I was one of these creative people too. And I started doing various classes and stuff, and started with drawing and painting because I had a real sort of, that's what you should do first. That's where art begins. And although I was always quite practical and liked making things like sewing and doing DIY and stuff, I never really connected that to my creative practice till a lot later. But at Camberwell, I ended up doing some evening classes and then doing a foundation at Camberwell. And somehow that sort of led me to find out about this degree course at Brighton. And I realized I always liked 3D objects. And even, yeah, the drawings that I've had in the exhibition are still 3D objects. So I was very drawn to being able to work with the materials and have those practical workshops. And the course at Brighton allowed us to sort of choose between different materials and different kind of pathways between art, craft and design. And I just found that really appealing, that I could find out for myself along the way where I wanted to go with it.
So was it the case a little bit that you weren't necessarily thinking fine art at the time that you kind of entered into?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
I guess I kind of imagined, I had just come out of, you know, doing a job and being very useful, and I thought I would end up being a designer. Yeah, that sounds great. And the course at Brighton was very much about teaching material skills so that you could either be a maker or a designer, but you would come from an understanding of how the material worked. So yeah, I was quite surprised to end up at the kind of more abstract end of the scale. It's not what I would have predicted for myself at all. It still surprises me now, I think.
Yeah.
That's interesting, and it's led you to make these kind of tools within your practice, and you've described them as, is it right, functionalist tools? Can you expand on that a little bit, and how that leads to the imagination a little bit? Or
yeah, I guess around the time that I started this kind of exploration of going to art school, there was an article in, I think, World of Interiors, one of those swanky magazines, and it had some really extraordinary photography of what's called the Rural Life Museum at Waterperry Gardens in Oxfordshire. And they've made these kind of really extraordinary displays of old, raw handmade, worked iron, steel hand tools. But they became these really abstract and really sort of beautiful objects. So that really kind of connected for me, because they were the sorts of tools and things that I was used to seeing on the farm at home as a child, but they were suddenly these beautiful abstract objects as well. So that sort of set off a bit of maybe obsession would be the word, with the sort of the shapes and the forms and the fact that they'd been smithed, they'd been made by hand. I have ancestors who would have blacksmiths who would have been making those kinds of things here. So it all kind of started to really gel for me, and I started to collect old tools. And I was really interested that if you go back maybe 50 years, there are hand tools that exist and there's this lovely quote from Thomas Heatherwick in the book Objectivity. He talks about the fact that the tools are orphans, and it's not so much that the thing they do they've been replaced and the activity is done in some other way. It's like the thing itself maybe doesn't even need to be done anymore. And I was really curious. The iPad was launched that year with the strapline of "you already know how to use it," which is glorious, for a piece of tech in your hand. That's kind of what you want, that intuitive interface. But at the same time, it was a really interesting collision between that and sort of haptic skill and learning and the physicality of making something. And I realized that in my job, most of what was called work was achieved by clicking a button. And actually, a lot of our work is done by clicking buttons. Whereas here I was learning how to use tools and great big machines, and it was all noise and smell, and it was just so exciting. I can't remember what you asked me now, Jay.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So there was that transition, obviously, from two quite different worlds. And just in that sense, you tell us a bit about a bit more about maybe the haptic and the idea of drawing as a perhaps very physical, especially with the way that you work with materials. What that means to you and your work and your practice in the landscape that you work in.
Yeah, I guess when I was making those objects, I always kind of saw them as material drawings. There was never a sort of sense of it being finished. It was quite an intuitive process of making. I would usually start by going out and gathering bits of wood and twigs and sticks, and sort of seeing where they would lead me. And I was curious about the fact that, I guess when I started really looking at different types of tools and tools that existed, particularly things that exist in sets. So things like, if you've got like a roll of gardening tools or a roll of manicure tools, there's a lot of things in there that are actually quite similar. They're just a different size. There'll always be some kind of poking thing. There'll be a file, there'll be a little brush, So I got into this kind of thing of 7 archetypal functions, and I worked with that for quite a long time. And then for my solo show in 2018, I started to kind of want to spread that out a bit and to think more about the landscape. I'd been back in Northern Ireland at that point for, I guess, about 6 years, and I was starting to want to sort of develop other ideas a bit. So there was a sense of drawing and measuring and looking at the landscape that really started to take over at that point.
And then that's correct. Yeah, and then from the landscape, you then unearth different bits of peat and stuff like that, and you churn those into like different drawing tools as well. So like you'll turn them into charcoal and stuff. Can you expand on that a little bit? How that process comes about?
Yeah. So that I discovered I guess there was this really lovely progression from looking at tools and objects to this connection with peat as a material that comes from the earth. I travelled over to Yorkshire in, I don't remember what year that was, maybe quite a while ago now, for an exhibition called Make It Slow that was organised by Chrysalis Arts. And the museum had sent me these set of photographs of tools that they had in their collection that I was responding to. And I get stuck with this every time. Even though there's a measurement on the photograph, when it's on your screen, your brain decides what size that object is. So when I got there and discovered that this thing that I thought was maybe 8 or 10 inches long was, 6 feet tall and hanging on the wall, I was really kind of blown away. And I'd made this tiny little silver object in response to it. But also this thing was called a peat spade. And I was like, what do you mean? Why do you need a peat spade in Yorkshire? I didn't realise till then that peat exists all over Northern Europe and had been used as a fuel by people for thousands of years, I guess. So I then got really into this, using the shapes and forms of the different tools that people had used to dig or cut peat in different parts of the world, and was really researching that. And in the process of that research came across the fact that in the Orkneys, the blacksmiths used to make charcoal for their forges by doing a charcoal burn of peat, because there wasn't enough, there was no coal and there were no trees, and therefore they needed to get that higher heat to be able to smith metal. So in the same way that you would make, say, willow charcoal that we know of as artists for drawing with, where you have a burn where you reduce the oxygen, you control it, you burn it in some kind of container with as low oxygen as possible. With the peat, you can dig a hole and stack it up. They would have buried it and had like a huge pile of it. I made some in a little pot, like a cooking pot, that worked perfectly well. So I had, no real expectations of it as any kind of refined drawing material, and it can be it varies enormously. It's very unreliable, but the fact that I was able to dig some peat out of the bottom of the field outside my house and be able to then make drawings that are about this landscape where I live with the material that came out of the earth, that pleases me to no end, I think.
Yeah, it's really a few things you touched on there are really interesting. That you mentioned about this idea of narrative and object and that relationship.
Yes.
The fact that you returned to Northern Ireland, I think, after 25 years living away.
Yeah.
And you've got that, there's family roots. Is it 5 generations? How do you? Can you tell us a bit more about the idea of that? The narrative with the landscape, and there's this obviously sort of cycle of materials and processes that seem to flow into that idea of maybe history and place.
Yeah, I'm really interested in I guess there's that whole thing of sort of growing up on a farm and you kind of in this place, and you just, the fact that you know your neighbours and you've all grown up together and your parents all grew up together and everybody else, and that goes back for generations, it just seems normal. And then you go and live in a city somewhere, and I went on a particular course, a land art based course at the Steiner College down in Forest Row in East Sussex. And there were people there who were learning how to understand the landscape and how to look at nature. And I think that's when it really started to dawn on me that there was a place in the world that I already belonged to and that I already had a really sort of instinctive knowledge of. And I mean, I couldn't have imagined planning it, but I ended up moving back to the very spot where I grew up. So when I go out and walk my dog, I'm sort of looking at the same hedges that I used to stare into when I was a child. And there's something, I guess, having been away and never expecting really to come back here, I have a real appreciation for what that place is. And then in parallel to that, just to kind of really emphasize, I guess, the connection, there was a substantial road upgrade. So I live about 2 field lengths away from what is a fairly counts as a main road around here. It's the main road that would run from Belfast up to the north coast. And it had been built by the Victorian engineer Charles Lanyon and crosses a bog, quite a substantial bit of peat bog. But it was being upgraded into a dual carriageway. So the first 2 years that I lived here, the landscape was literally being excavated and dug up and changed every day. And there was all this heavy plant and beeping and noise, and it was really kind of extraordinary. So I guess part of that, using the peat from that and wanting to kind of document and engage with the landscape, was partly provoked by the fact that it was being dug up in front of my eyes. Just when I'd finally made my way back here.
So there's that kind of sort of archaeology, that unearthing and revisiting sort of history and time that's gone by. And
well, interesting use of the word archaeology. There was some commissioned archaeology as part of the roadworks, and the guys who did that gave a really interesting talk in the local village. And they came up with the fact that they found evidence of the oldest inland settlement in Ireland, just here. Wow. And somewhere on the shelf behind me is missing a Neolithic axe head. You know, so there's just loads of Neolithic settlements and stuff that was excavated. So that really sort of tuned me into this idea of deeper time, and that there's a landscape here that was glacial at a time. It's a sort of smoothed off little drumlins and hills. And then it's been farmed for at least 6,000 or 7,000 years. There's evidence of farming from a lot, you know, way, way back. So that kind of collision and conversation between the humans and the landscape has sort of really been where I've been at for the last couple of years. And where do I belong in that? And how does that feel compared to living in the city?
Yeah, it's interesting. With some of your functionalist tools, if they were unearthed in the future, what do you think people would think of them? Would they associate or give them some sort of function that maybe they didn't have? You know?
That's an interesting thought, because the things that we do dig up as in archaeological contexts, we assume that they had a real practical application. The thought that, you know, somebody made them and put them there just to trick us would be...
would throw us.
keep second guessing.
Yeah, but you know, it's interesting watching people pick them up, because you can see that people often, you know, some kind of gesture comes that tries to, you can see people start to do something with them. It's like if you give a hand a tool, it starts to want to do things. Little mimes and things happen, and then other people just get really cross. They go, you've got a function in mind, and you're keeping it secret from me, and why won't you tell me? No, I just want you to play with it.
They'd like almost a manual with it. Is it the people that need some instructions, perhaps, or?
Yeah, but it's just curious, and I just kind of wanted that curiosity, because equally I had this other collection of real tools that to most of us look just as abstract and bonkers, because we have no idea. And there were things that even now I've got the odd thing that nobody can tell me what they've been used for. So that's just as valid as a functionalist tool now.
I quite enjoy the fact that they leave it gets left to the imagination. I've seen some of them on your website and stuff, and I've really enjoyed looking at them and it could be this, it could be that, but does it really matter? And I just love the fact that you've gone through such lengths and such a process to make them, and yet they become an object. And I wanted to also ask you about how you see self-portrait that you submitted Drawing Beyond Itself as a 3D object, and what pigments you use to make those, and they're quite tiny as well. So wondering if you could explain a little bit about that for us.
Yeah, they first came about on a residency in September last year at this extraordinary place in County Cavan, just over the border in the Republic of Ireland. There's a retreat centre called Anna McCarrig. That's the former home of Tyrone Guthrie, who was a playwright. So I was there for a week and had basically a drawing studio, and I applied for the bursary to go on the residency because I was wanting to sort of connect into a different part of me and a part of how I relate to being here. And I wanted to spend time drawing, and sort of quite deliberately sort of banned myself from taking photographs. It was like, if I wanted to just, it's so easy to just take a picture and then never look at it again. So I spent some time, and I'd also had these long rolls of paper, so that the pieces are drawn on a roll of paper that's about 5 centimeters wide, and it's like 50, 60 meters long. And I think the scientist bit of me likes the idea that it feels like a recording of data on this long roll of paper. So in the first instance, I think I'd made 7 strips, and they were the same height as me, so they were 5 foot 10 inches long, and I taped them back together and drew myself out on this sort of composite surface that I'd made from sticking these together. And then I took it apart, and I was just kind of messing about, and I folded them up. And then I had this wire binding that I'd taken with me because I wanted to make some sort of arbitrary sculpture while I was there. So I started binding them together and realized they became these little objects, but it was still a drawing, but it was also an object. And that felt like a really nice moment. Because, and then as I carried it on as a kind of as a kind of diary through actually October last year. So it's interesting that the exhibition has been on exactly 12 months pretty much from when they were made. So I had a practice of making a drawing every day and using a material that related to something I'd been doing that day. So if I'd been mowing the garden, then I would put some grass through a wheatgrass juicer and draw the line with the greenness of the grass. I poked the mud out of the treads of my boots. I did use some of the peat charcoal. I used some milk from the farm to draw with, but it just disappeared. But, you know, so it was just a kind of visual diary where there was a line on the piece of paper that related to something about that day. And then I would fold it up and bind it closed, so you don't really see it. Yeah, I'm realizing I have one just here.
Yeah, that's really, I'm just thinking with the idea of obviously the show that you're part of, and that this work was part of the idea of expanded drawing. Also the idea of the work being called a self-portrait, but you've approached it from, you know, an expanded sense. It's not tradition, what we'd usually be used to as a self-portrait. So yeah, just wondering about, you know, you seem to, just to ask you a little bit about the idea of self-identity, but extended within the landscape, and the materials. Is that something that is, so it's obviously deliberate in terms of the title, and how would you link that to the idea of expanded drawing? It seems like there's something really interesting going on there with an expanded sense of identity, whether that's different when you return to Ireland than it would have been in living in a city, or there seems to be a connection with the landscape and the materials, which seems quite unique, you know, to you.
Yeah.
I hope that's not too difficult a question.
Huge question, Jayson.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I've realized, you know, over the last year or so, I've been sort of trying to sort of turning over what is it that I'm actually doing and why and how and all of that. And I wanted to really engage. I guess I'd been back here 7 years, and to really sort of engage. I was aware that the work I started making in Brighton, the tools in particular, were based in a view of home or place, this place, that was still very rooted in the city. And I think I've kind of possibly maybe come to the end of that cycle and realizing I've been in this landscape now for long enough, and I'm here now. You know, that whole thing of after 7 years, all your cells have renewed. You know, you're now completely remade. So I started to, and I like to set definitions and boundaries. So with the tools, I liked to follow these 7 archetypes. I like to make them in sets of 7. And I find if I set myself a boundary, I find that really interesting to then explore what's inside the boundary, and otherwise I get scattered and I go off and anything could happen. So here I started to set physical boundaries of a certain part of the landscape that I was going to document, and most recently by sort of defining the horizon. So there's an area of, I guess maybe, actually I can't put a measurement on it, I could be making it up, but there's, you know, an area of countryside that I can see. And interestingly, the distance or the clarity with which I can see it has changed during lockdown. So we're under a flight path, I guess, or just the level of pollution has changed, even here in the middle of the countryside. And the light in the spring, especially when the weather was extraordinary and lovely, it was like being back in the 70s. It was just extraordinary. It's been absolutely gorgeous. Yeah, being able to see. So what I can see is actually different, the definition with which I can see that landscape.
And ever changing, you talk about the idea of a sort of a diary. So it's walking and looking and living in that landscape, which is, I guess, like you're saying, it always evolves, and with your drawing practice, I imagine.
Yeah, and I guess, and having a dog means you have to go out into the landscape every day, regardless of what the landscape might be doing. So that's, yeah, you get to see. And what I've been photographing a section of the hedges every day since March. So I'm looking forward to putting that. Although, you know, that's not quite a drawing, and I have allowed myself to photograph from that point of view. But I've really, for me, I guess drawing is an activity. I never set out to make a drawing as such. I guess I think I caught myself using that phrase a minute ago. No, that's not really. So I think it's an activity. It's a gesture. It's an expression of making a mark in some way that, and somehow captures a particular moment or a feeling or a set of feelings. Maybe it's definitely more about capturing that gesture than it is about recording something visual. It's a response for me.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing with drawing. I think it bleeds into so many different areas, and it kind of it's not immediately obvious, and that's one of the reasons why we decided to put on an expanded drawing show of the four of us at Air Gallery. I was going to ask you about your thoughts and opinions on the show and the idea of expanded drawing and where you sit with that. Do you feel like the work is about the landscape first, drawing after, or is it the other way around, do you think, or is it changing for you, or is it, if that makes sense?
I think it changes probably a lot of the time. There's it's kind of a dialogue, I think. And I think I probably have come to this, I think when I was younger, I would have always said, I can't draw, you know, and that whole sort of what is drawing and the shoulds and sort of a draftsmanship thoughts about drawing and what it should be. So it's still relatively novel to me to think I can make the marks that I want to make on paper, and that is a drawing, and it's just as has its own validity. It's drawing. That's fine. So it's sort of an ongoing exploration, and really the sort of next stage of that is to think about how to capture the drawings in materials in 3D. So I've been sort of bouncing that back again. So the 3D work is becoming a bit more abstract. And yeah, so for example, I recently made some work. I made some drawing in response to some music, then made 3D objects, and then put the 3D objects on an overhead projector and drew the shadows. So they went from sound to 2D to 3D and back to 2D. So they're still being played with.
So yeah, in that, so you talk about the idea of sort of transformation. I'm just curious, thinking about these objects and the work you make, which I don't know if you necessarily think of it as site specific, but in the sense of quite a unique landscape or environment to be making this work in. How do you feel about it when the work is sort of situated in what might be more of a sort of contemporary art gallery, or how does that feel to you to then give these objects over to that space, and yeah, what's that process like? How do you see that?
I love the idea of them being in other spaces and that they have their own identity. That, you know, I think it's been there's a really double edge to this whole kind of lockdown situation, whereby I guess this open call for this exhibition happened before that, and I probably wouldn't have travelled over to Manchester to see the exhibition, and yet I've probably seen it more and engaged with you guys far more because of the circumstances than if things had gone ahead as they were before. So there's something about the work being both site specific and abstract. The architect John Pawson talks about that in a really lovely way. It's a response to place, but it's also completely abstract. There's nothing representational about it.
Yeah, I guess it's always interesting to think about, because the work's so sort of process based, and it's so rich in that sense. So it's also I guess quite a big question for what happens when that work is then sort of displayed in a gallery, and obviously there are some supporting text that gives an insight, but
yes,
much of that process, I guess, in some ways is lost or perhaps hidden or only slightly revealed. So there's a
and I realised as well there's a curiosity in them being a self-portrait but folded up and enclosed. So there's a sense of what's revealed and seen, and there's a hint. Because there's a continuous line that's then accordion folded, you get dib, 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 dib of the line on each fold. And you're left to wonder what joins those bits. And I know that some people, that I've had some in my solo show at the start of the year, and some people bought them and unraveled them. They can do if they want, but I find it really kind of, I don't know how I feel about that.
I suppose the work is quite personal to you and to your work, so I kind of like the idea that you don't get to unravel and you get to just kind of think about it further, and it definitely made me want to read about your work more, because they became these objects as opposed to these drawings that weren't immediately obvious. I mean, I've seen pictures of them unraveled, and I don't find them as interesting as if they are together in a line. Do you know what I mean? And I think that to me is really exciting, because I think art should definitely use your imagination in some way, and trying to engage with it, not at a distance, but in some ways trying to put yourself in that kind of narrative a little bit.
Yes, I think there's something nice about the title or the idea or something, that provokes whoever's looking at it to then have their own response. You know, that they're free to imagine, and I guess with those objects in the same way that would be with the tools, that someone can imagine, everyone's going to imagine their own next step of that, I think.
Yeah, so that seems to be a kind of connecting strand, that it's the idea of imagination as well, that you talk quite often about, that you don't want to sort of hand over too much, directly sort of dictate to the audience, but that you like to leave a space for interpretation. Could you talk a little bit about that, the role of some works are in their nature a little bit more obvious or direct, and some are, there's this sense of to sort of given a thread to invite you in, and then start to question what the work is, and which is perfect for the show, in the nature of us trying to question what drawing can be.
I think in a way it comes from the fact that I come to art practice later in my life. So the idea of things not having to be spelled, because I came from sort of a world of logic and things being very organized and clear. So I like the idea of that ambiguity and engaging the playfulness of what's going on, but also the idea that an object can have a narrative. I'm much more interested in objects and stories that they tell us than I don't naturally have as deep a response with 2D imagery as I do with objects. Completely forgotten what you asked me, Jayson.
Yeah, no, just about that space of imagination that you open up for the audience, which is a nice thing and quite an intriguing thing, I think. But perhaps not too much has to be said about it, because it kind of is there. And
I obviously went off imagining something and lost.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to sort of thinking of we're going to have to wrap up fairly soon. Time on Zoom, but I guess as a maybe kind of just a slightly left field question, but do you have a kind of early memory of I know you're saying you came to art later on, but do you have an early memory, especially the fact that you returned to where you grew up, a kind of something either about a creative process or something about the materials that you now use that you think might have maybe come full circle and influenced you to sort of get back with that place in a creative way? Is there?
I guess the textile, the influence of bringing textiles back in would come from that. I guess as a child, I'm very conscious that even in primary school, we were taught to knit and sew and make clothes and treadle, singer, sewing machine. This was the olden days. This was the 70s. But the fact that it was like a rural primary school in Northern Ireland, those things were still very much part of the curriculum. So, and in a way, I sort of had to unlearn some of those proper ways of doing things and let a different kind of. So I do like that sort of mark making with stitch. And I guess I'm aware that although I like 3D objects, I like to be building things. I'm adding on rather than carving back or taking away. So I guess that's always something I would have done as a child, of piling things up. Playing mud pies. Maybe I'm still just making mud pies.
Yeah, there's definitely it feels like there's a playfulness to it, which is really nice, and does make you think perhaps of how children are inquisitive and if you get to go out into nature and you just collect things and play with them. So yeah, it seems to have a bit of that charm to me, and then learning about your the story behind your work as well.
Yeah, I guess maybe it's just me going back to some kind of childhood playtime.
Yeah,
I get to do it now. Yeah,
sounds great.
Yeah. So I mean, we only got 2 minutes left, haven't we?
I think less than a minute actually. So
time's flying.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to talk some more, but unfortunately
we always have to make sure that we wrap it up in time before it cuts us off. So yeah, maybe it's
really brutal.
Yeah. I guess thank you for spending the time with us and giving us a bit more of an insight into your work. And
pleasure. Really nice to actually to get to talk to you live.
Yeah.
I've watched some of the other conversations we've had with people and seen bits of the exhibition, so it's really great to be part of it.
Yeah,
brilliant.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again.
Take care.
And you.
Bye.
Bye.